Thrilled that so many of you could join us for this discussion on resiliency in civil society. And I am coming to you from the suburbs of Washington, D.C., from Bethesda, Maryland. So for me, it's good morning. I know for those of you around the world, it's good afternoon or good evening. And so people are going to slowly be joining us, but we only have 1 hour to cover a lot of information. And so I'm going to go ahead and get started. So again, my name is Julia Roig. I'm the president of PartnersGlobal, and I'll be introducing PartnersGlobal in just a second. And you've joined us for a conversation about resiliency in the civil society sector. We want to be introducing a framework that PartnersGlobal has developed over the last couple of years on civil society resiliency that we think could be particularly helpful for many of you that are experiencing a similar kind of crisis moment, a shock to our system. And we want to offer just some initial ideas and some potential tools, and also open up a conversation with you, even though we're in presentation mode. Hopefully through the chat, we'll be able to share experiences with each other. So here's the agenda for the hour. First of all, just a couple of housekeeping rules. I'm going to introduce a little bit more about PartnersGlobal. We're going to define resiliency a little bit more, what the concept, how we understand it, and why we developed this framework. And then I'm going to very quickly go through the framework and talk about the different factors that we've developed under this resiliency concept for civil society. I'm going to try and go through that fairly quickly and with not a ton of examples, because I'd like to get through that in about 30 minutes. So then we're going to poll you all as the audience and ask which of the factors you'd like us to focus a little bit more attention on, so that the last 30 minutes we can really think about the practice and the examples according to the issues that maybe you're really struggling with the most or interested in hearing from your colleagues the most. So first off, a couple of housekeeping rules. We are going to have the conversation with each other through the chat function. And so there's different functions on Zoom. I hope that you can do the full screen view and that you're able to see the Zoom chat. And so maybe we can just practice just a little bit. I would love to know where you all are coming from. So if you'd like to type into the chat function either your country or the state that you're signing in from, why don't you all just let us know in the chat function where you are. So we've got friends from California and Brooklyn. Love to see both friends and family. We have folks from Kenya and Mexico, Canada, El Salvador, Nigeria, Italy, Georgia, Serbia. Isn't that fun? And others, you can see all the way from Maryland, probably close to me. It's lovely to have such diversity with us today. And so you can see that there's going to be a lot of different perspectives, although, you know, many of us, and I think that this is a very special moment to be discussing resiliency, because so many of us are facing a similar moment in time, a similar shock to our system, requiring us to be jointly coming together to talk about how we're staying connected and staying resilient. So I think, you know, we've got a lot of continents and a lot of countries represented here. And so I'm going to introduce PartnersGlobal also as an international network that came together to be thinking through this resiliency framework. So as I mentioned, I'm the president of Partners Global. I'm based here in Washington, D.C. We're just now celebrating our 30th anniversary. We started in 1989, and for the first 30 years of our organization, we were very focused on investing in the civil society sector, in helping to establish local organizations that served a function for protecting democratic values, using very sophisticated conflict resolution and peace building techniques. And we now have a network of centers, we call them Centers for Change and Conflict Management, that share a brand. So if we're Partners Global, we have Partners Poland here, we have the Fundación Cambio Democrático, our partner sister center in Argentina, Partners Yemen, Partners Colombia, Partners Georgia. So you see in the world, we're mostly in West Africa, very heavily concentrated in Central and Eastern Europe, because that's where the organization started its roots. And this whole call to resiliency really came out of our network experience. We have been working with the civil society sector for years, and there's a tradition around organizational development, of course, and sustainability. And more, I think that we've been looking for new ways of shoring up the sector. And in the last 5 years, as we've been confronting issues of changing civic space, of more authoritarian regimes really questioning the role of civil society, we realized that we needed new tools to adapt to shifting environments that didn't take for granted that the role of civil society was a value that was necessarily shared by the governments that we are operating under, or even understood by our constituencies. And so together with Civicus, another large network of civil society actors really committed to democratic values, we invested in the Resiliency Plus framework. So once again, before I kind of jump in to discussion of our framework, I think it would be really nice to hear from all of you. When I even say the word resiliency, what comes to your mind? And so once again, if you could put in the chat, what do you think of? You are spending an hour of your precious time with us. What comes to mind for you when I say the word resiliency? And just type anything that comes to your mind. There's no wrong answers. It's really kind of a collective understanding, and then I can share what our understanding is. So intersectionality and adaptability, unity and equity, adaptation, absolutely. How are we going to be thriving, bouncing back, having the capacity to adapt? That's right. The ability to face challenges, the capacity to recover our staying power, how to continue our mission through thick and thin, standing firm in the face of a forceful storm. That's a nice metaphor, isn't it? How to be flexible, how to keep being strong. These are all really great answers. And connectivity, it's one of my favorite ones, Manuela, thank you. There's an article that just came out a couple of days ago from the nonprofit Quarterly, which is an industry magazine here in the US, and the ability to have hope. Thank you for that positive reinforcement. There was an article saying that resiliency and resilience as a term was something that was potentially being co-opted for meaning that we needed to protect the status quo somehow, that we needed to be able to go back to normal, and that therefore social change agents should be wary and should be not adapting this word resilience, because certain aspects of society want things to go back to normal. And for those of us who are change agents, who are working for social justice, who want to be seeing positive change, we shouldn't get sucked into this resiliency kind of new sexy topic that everybody's using. And I'm glad that that question came up. But we absolutely take a different perspective at Partners Global. We created the Resiliency Plus framework specifically for social change agents and for those who are working for democratic values to be able to continue to do their work, even in the face of very uncertain times. And this has been a 3-year endeavor. We had no idea we would be facing what we're facing now with the coronavirus pandemic. And so it's not just preparing for future shocks, it's literally adapting the capacity to deal with current shocks. One thing I did want to mention just with regards to housekeeping, if you'd like to see the responses from other attendees, I saw someone just joined us from Turkey as well. Please open up the chat function. You can manipulate the way that you see the Zoom discussion happening, and then you can see each other's comments and questions as well. Okay, so then this is our definition, because we're very focused on organizational resiliency within the civil society sector, because we talk about community resilience, there's natural disaster, resilience. Resilience really came out of the ecological movement. It comes out of biology, which is why I think there's an understanding of biology kind of being able to kind of be resilient, to go back to the way things were. We think of organizational resiliency as the ability of our sector to adapt to the impacts of these very quickly external changing environments and threats, shocks, not only external, but also internal. And we have been working with many civil society organizations in order to think about their preparedness. Now we're all very quickly adapting to now thinking about our actual response. The important aspect of organizational resilience is that we need to understand the system that we work within. So I think that there's a big difference between our previous efforts at organizational sustainability in the sector, that of course, organizational development is very important still with regards to shoring up kind of our internal capacities. But a lot of resilience work is focused on an external awareness, to see the interconnections, the elements of the system. Obviously, as a pandemic is unfolding, I think that that interconnectivity is, and really the way that we have to really depend on each other. It's a different approach to how we manage our organizations and think about our mission. So our approach then to working with organizations on their resiliency is really focusing on a mindset and a different approach, like I said, to organizational strengthening, which is around situational awareness, connectivity, and an adaptive mindset. Those are just some of the factors I'm going to talk about a little bit more. Okay, so I am going to go through this part fairly quickly, like I said. About the next 15 minutes, I'm going to try really quickly just to give kind of a high level definition of each of these factors. And then I'd like to hear from you what you want to hear more from, so that I can really home in on a little bit more detail, because there's a lot to cover. It's too much within 1 hour. So these are the 7 factors of resilient civil society organizations that we've developed. My colleague just put into the chat a link to the full framework document. It's a long document. It goes into a lot of details about how we came up with this. But what I would like to say is this was very much based on a very intensive literature review on other fields and how they think about resiliency, the experience of both our network within the Partners family and also other civil society organizations, in order to then be able to put together a lot of disparate efforts and focuses and programs that we've been thinking about how to shore up the civil society sector. And we tried to bring that all together under one framework. So I'm going to go through each of these quickly one by one. But the one message that I have is that it's all interconnected. We really can't necessarily only work on a resiliency ethos within an organization without addressing issues of the legitimacy of the organization, their transparency practice. I'll describe a little bit more what that means. But this idea that perhaps that we could bifurcate each of these elements within an organization is very challenging, because when you build up one, you see that another one of your organizational kind of aspects of resiliency is also bolstered. At the same time, if there's a weakness, if there's a vulnerability within your organizational system, if you're not managing your communications, that really also can then make you more vulnerable with how connected you are with others. And so the main message is how interconnected all of these aspects of resiliency really are. So now I'm going to go through them one by one, because each of them also has a sub-factor within each high level. Oh, but first, let me talk a little bit more about the principles behind the Resiliency Plus framework. I mentioned a little bit the difference between sustainability and resiliency. I get this question a lot, and in fact, I was kind of discussing with my husband last night, who also is in the development sector, has done a lot of work with civil society, and he said, isn't resiliency just a new term for what we've been doing for 30 years, developing the civil society sector? Haven't we put just a new sexy topic on top of something that we always do? We're really good at that in the international development field. You talk about leadership development, and then you talk about social enterprise and entrepreneurialism. And as somebody who's been doing this work as long as I have, I truly believe that this is different. Resilient organizations are adapting to a changing environment. Sustainable organizations take for granted potentially. So if you have a good business model, if you've got all of the aspects of a strong organization that functions within a stable context that you think you can predict the future, you sustain your work. We want organizations to get to the place where they can thrive, where they can be sustainable. But there's a mindset of assuming that the future is going to be fluid, is going to change, especially now. If you have a fixed mindset and you are very stable and very sustainable, and yet then a shock happens, we're going to talk a little bit about what those shocks might be. This global pandemic is a huge shock. You may have had a very sustainable business model, but the ability to now adapt to what's happening in your environment is why resiliency is different. So then therefore, one of the key principles is the need to do scenario planning, because how can we plan for what we don't know is coming? The best we can do is come up with, well, scenario A may happen, scenario B may happen, scenario 3, or mixing metaphors there, numbers and letters, and then be able to have a culture of adaptability. Because if we can think about the complexity of our system, assume things are not going to change, stay the same, that we're looking at not just our one program, our one mission, and how we may be affected, but how our colleagues, how our peers, how our community, how the political dynamics are affecting us. These are the principles of resiliency. And then the final thing that I want to mention is we are talking about an organizational change process. And so the way that Partners Global has been acting upon this framework is through a system of coaching and accompaniment of organizations in this shift of mindset. And we've found that the best way of doing that is by peer-to-peer learning, by sharing with each other how we're adapting, and to have a coach who can really help you think through the change in mindset that is needed to confront all of these factors. And so we now have a whole cadre, a whole series of resiliency coaches and facilitators. Many of them I saw are on the call with us from around the world, who can adapt these factors to the particular context in which they're working, because this is not one size fits all. It's not a process of adaptive change, of change management. What's happening in Kenya is going to look very different than what's happening in Serbia, is what's happening in the United States. And so I think that the coach's ability to bring together cohorts of peers to have discussions, but also work with individual leaders. And that's our commitment to really tailoring this framework and its delivery to different contexts. Okay, so quickly going through the aspects of the framework. I've now said the word adaptive probably 20 times this morning. So starting out with the ability of the main factor of the adaptive capacity, preparing for the unknown. None of us could have prepared for what we're experiencing right now. And yet we do have leadership capabilities of adaptation. We have the ability to have, again, these three subcomponents under the factor is, how fixed is our organization? Do we have such strict governance systems, the ways that we work, that we aren't able to quickly shift? We have compiled a lot of information on this factor. One by one, we've been putting out a content series on each of the factors, and my colleague just put in the chat a blog that we have online on adaptive capacity, with a lot of different materials and articles and videos and tools that you can use, especially for contingency planning, because this is one that I think sometimes the nonprofit sector is not as good at contingency planning. Those perhaps in the health sector, we know that our colleagues in the military, we work a lot with the security sector. They're very good at contingency planning. They do tabletop exercises. They make sure that if this happens, they're ready to go. These are aspects that need to be embedded in our organization. And yet, I think that there's aspects of adaptive leadership that you can incorporate right now. We did one of our very first webinars that we hosted in our resiliency series was on adaptive leadership, because we felt that that was the most needed for our sector right now. And a close colleague based in Geneva, Natalie, gave, I thought, some really good advice. She essentially said, in order to be an adaptive leader, you really do need a lot of bravery right now. We might not have all of the information that we need. We don't know when we're going to open up again here in the US. Maybe it's going to be June. How long are we going to be teleworking? So sometimes you have to make quick decisions and just trust your instincts, doing the best that you can. You might not be able to be as collaborative as you normally would because of the agility that you need in decision making. But I loved her point that you have to lead from the heart. You have to show vulnerability. You need to say, I don't necessarily have all of the answers, but I am going to communicate with you what I'm thinking about these decision processes, because adaptive leadership is also very transparent. What do I know? What do I not know? So please check out in the chat, we also just put the video of that 1 hour webinar where we discussed adaptive leadership, if you'd like to find out a little bit more about that. Okay, the second component of our framework is a resiliency ethos. And again, these might seem slightly redundant with each other, but it's the way that organizations are embracing uncertainty. And I've got to say that in my experience working with my networks, with my staff, with my peer organizations, as we come together I actually see us struggling the most with this one. I understand why, because when you see the brain science around why human beings default to thinking that things are going to be the same in the future. I mean, how else can we function as human beings if we don't expect things to be the same in the future? Then it's really difficult to institutionalize and to bring in a culture of resiliency within your organization, to then constantly needing to say it's okay to think that we're living in uncertain times. But then what does that look like in practice? I think it looks like a culture where risk-taking and experimentation is celebrated, where you've got all levels of the organization contributing to new ideas and experimentation. You don't necessarily need the command and control center to hold tightly to whatever the response is. And then that third aspect of staff readiness and well-being. If we have a resilient ethos, we need to understand how traumatic change and uncertainty can be for us as leaders, and for our staff. And so I think if we're triaging as organizations right now, we need to be focusing on our staff well-being more than anything. And what that looks like is going to be different cultures. What's acceptable with regards to really thinking about the psychosocial well-being of your staff. I've gotten feedback from members of our network that doesn't seem very culturally appropriate within a professional setting to be kind of snooping around in somebody's kind of psychological well-being. And yet these are such just really unimaginable times. People are isolated, people are afraid. And yet as civil society organizations, we're asking for a lot of pivoting, we're asking for a lot of creative thinking, we're asking for forging ahead, even with all of this financial uncertainty. And really the trauma of living through people that we know may have died. We're worried about a wave of poverty and inequality. All of this is weighing on our minds. And so I would say shore up your staff well-being, first and foremost, figuring out how you can support your team to be able to be their best selves in order to then have all of the experimentation and creativity. And so for whatever that looks like in your context, for us, we've been talking about having less Zoom meetings. My God, being on Zoom, and here you are all spending time with me now, which I very much appreciate. And yet there's something exhausting about interacting with people online all day long. And so protecting time that we're not going to be online, different work hours for young mothers or fathers who need to be also doing childcare. There's all sorts of meditation and different support that we can give for our physical health to our staff. And so these are things that we're going to be really also focusing on in the future with regards to a lot of different well-being ideas. We have a special speaker that I hope that you'll join us in just a couple of weeks to focus on this. And then if you're a leader of an organization, like they say in the airplane, put the safety mask on yourself first so that you're in good physical and mental shape to help your teams. Okay, the third aspect of our framework is situational awareness and systems thinking. Again, this is one of those big mindset shifts. We have a tendency in our sector to work in silos. We have our own theories of change. We think that we need to invest in young women. They're gonna lead the way. We need education efforts. We need to make sure government is transparent. We wanna make sure that we're protecting the environment. We're holding governments accountable, and the business community. We need economic development. We all have a piece of change, and everybody's right. All of these things need to happen. And so, how are we in times of shocks and in change? Whether again, our framework was developed thinking about closing civic space. So we were really thinking about political shocks. We were thinking about when authoritarian regimes started closing down the space for civil society to operate. How are we aware of those political dynamics? So looking at external threats and your awareness of your external environment, right now it feels very different, right? We're looking at a global pandemic, but we also have to be aware of how governments are responding to the pandemic, and how the civic space, this is a term of art, how are civil society organizations, nonprofits, able to continue to work with their constituencies, to be a channel for the voice of citizens in decision making? Do we still have security to operate? We're all a little bit worried about how governments have to track the spread of the virus through cell phones. Will that technology be used against activists in the future who want to be organizing for certain political gains? And so, to the extent that we're taking time to think about the external threats that we face, not only that, but also our internal vulnerabilities, this is a really difficult one as coaches to be addressing with organizations, because these are really sensitive issues around leadership and organizational culture. But I head an organization, and I think about one of the internal vulnerabilities is a concentration of leadership. Is there just one person who's keeping the organization afloat and is the most connected to those outside of the organization, who can speak and is communicating on a regular basis? Or do we have that ability diffused? It's a vulnerability, isn't it? If we don't have shared leadership within the organization. There's other internal vulnerabilities around our financial preparedness. I'm going to talk about that in a second. But then finally, the systems awareness. This really comes from being connected with your peers and with government actors, so that you have the ability to reach out to others to gain an understanding of what's happening right now. And so my one plea to you is to get out of your own silo, talk to those organizations and peers and people who maybe you don't necessarily always interact with, because I think that's going to help you shore up your situational awareness. And we have a lot of resources around systems thinking and those tools that also are on a blog that was just shared in the chat. So I just recorded a little video about business acumen. And so I just did this last night, so I'm thinking about it a lot right now. When we talk about resiliency, most questions I get are around financial sustainability of the sector. And in fact, there was just a large survey that LINC, just put out. And my colleague might be able to put the link in the chat because she also helped to find that. They surveyed the sector right now around our biggest concerns as nonprofits working around the world. And everyone is the most worried about the financial impact of this crisis. There is no question that there is going to be a huge financial fallout. And so the moment of being entrepreneurial, it might feel like, I need a Band-Aid now. I need a reserve. I need a rapid response fund right now to give me the breathing space in order to even start to be more entrepreneurial. And I think that that's true. And I think philanthropists and funders that we're talking to are thinking in those terms. How can we fund civil society organizations right now to at least give them the breathing space to be thinking about experimenting and innovating. You know, it's not just about continuing to do your trainings online. And it's not just business as usual. I had a work plan. I had certain projects. I was going to be doing certain things, and now I just need to quickly adapt and innovate to be able to have a different delivery mechanism to accomplish those same goals. I think when we're talking about an entrepreneurial mindset that is very much attached to situational awareness, we have to start thinking in new terms about the market. Now, that's a business term, but just because we are mission-based organizations, it doesn't mean that we're not still thinking in terms of the value proposition that we provide to a market that has needs. And in my conversations with foundations, what they've said is don't just ask us for the Band-Aid. Come to us asking for support to go through a moment of contingency planning, experimentation, but come to us with the big idea of how you're going to be responding to what's coming next. And so this concept of experimentation and innovation, it has to happen. We do need to think in terms of diversifying our revenue stream. I think we've been thinking about this as a sector for a long time. Partners has a lot of materials on thinking about products and services that you can sell on the market. Even as democracy and in governance and peace building organizations, our network members have a lot of experience trying out different business models, selling their services as facilitators, opening up mediation centers. And in the chat box, you have a link to some of the resources that we've put together. But this idea of financial preparedness, that resilient organizations think about the worst case scenario. What would happen if this one funder pulled out? And unfortunately, many of us are living through that right now, aren't we? Some of our funders have come to us and said, well, you can't do that coalition building program that we thought you were going to, or we're not as focused on education planning because nobody's in school. And so we're going to put that grant on hold. There's some really bad practices of foundations or other funders saying, well, let's just wait and see what happens. And what I would say is, you know, this is going to be a lesson to all of us to think about shoring up our reserve funds to the extent that that's possible. But we don't necessarily have to do this alone. That's my biggest message to you. As you're dealing with your financial plan, please reach out to your board members, your staff, your peer organizations, and your donors. Not necessarily even as one organization, but as groups of organizations, not only asking to be saved through this moment with an infusion of kind of cash to save the organization, to prop us up, but come with an idea of what you think is really needed right now and what is going to continue to be needed, because you've done such a good job analyzing the situation. Because that leads me to the next factor of connectedness. We know that the most resilient organizations are making best use of their networks because we are greater than the sum of our parts. And these networks are not just local networks, they're regional networks, they're international networks that we are practicing an act of solidarity with each other. When there are political shocks, when there are stressors to one particular organization, they're more protected. And again, this is in terms of organizations that might be really facing some difficult situations. There's an example in Serbia of a journalist that was just reporting on what was actually happening in a hospital that was different from what the government was saying was happening. And this journalist was jailed. Because they were working with an organization that was so well connected with global organizations, with other associations of journalists in the region, there was such an outcry that was not an okay thing in a democratic society to do, that the journalist was released in a couple of days. And so I would really recommend that part of the strategy of your response right now is to very proactively be connected, even more so now than ever. And I think that some of the innovation that we were talking about before with a entrepreneurial mindset, don't just think about the products and services that you can provide as an organization, but think about the innovative partnerships that you can be building, because together we're going to be creating more shared value. Now, this is a term of art, isn't it? Shared value is a concept that comes from the business community about doing well by doing good, and that the business community has a lot to be offering right now as well. They're hurting, but they're also thinking about what's next. And so they will have need for partnerships with organizations that have access to communities and to new ideas. So think about your innovative partnerships in terms of business partnerships as well. I could talk for the next 3 hours on narrative competency, because this is one of my favorite issues. If you've seen anything from me on social media, you know I talk about narratives all the time. I really believe that our ability to engage with the narrative, and again, this is not just storytelling, this is understanding how people are making sense of the story that's happening, that's unfolding right now. And there's a lot of great work that's coming out of one of our partner organizations, the Frameworks Institute, that's helping to think about framing of our response to COVID-19. I think that we're going to share in the chat some of the framing advice that they have. But my main point is that you're intentionally communicating about the virus, about whatever issue you still care about, because this is the other thing. While the pandemic is unfolding, it's not as if the rights of prisoners no longer are important. It's not that we need to still be worried about homelessness and climate change and so many other issues. And so the way that we communicate right now, the way that we tap into both a story of the pandemic, but our role as the civil society sector, we are just as important as government and businesses. And I think that there's some framing advice about our distinct role as a sector. We are unique because of our connections with our communities, and that the nation needs the nonprofit sector right now more than ever. So the other aspects of this framework are crisis communications and adopting new technologies. And the last one that I'm going to very quickly go through so we can get to what you all want to hear a little bit more from each other about is our radical transparency. When I said that the nonprofit sector truly does have a role to play because we are connected to communities, we're embedded in communities, that has to be real. That can't be only on paper. We have to prioritize our accountability to our constituencies, which means that we're communicating with them with a lot of transparency. We're engaging with them right now. I know it's hard while we're doing social distancing, but to the extent that you're making an effort to creatively reach out to the people that you work with, checking in on them, getting their inputs on what their priority issues are, being able to communicate that to either decision makers or other service providers, and then again, making sure that you're very conscious of your organization's public image. So going back to narrative competency, and then also just, what does narrative mean, in fact? Maybe my colleague can also put our Narratives for Peace link into the chat. We actually developed a whole guidebook on narratives for peace. And what that means isn't necessarily how we're communicating peace building, but what is a narrative that is restorative of societal relationships? One thing that I think we need to be particularly conscious of right now is how we may be falling into the trap of a war metaphor for COVID-19, and how we talk about battling this pandemic, partially because it puts us into a posture less of solidarity with the world, and allows governments to also make citizens think of themselves more as soldiers in a fight, as opposed to a, a community that needs to come together to help each other. And so part of narrative engagement is really understanding how we're using language and the stories that we're tapping into, the way that we make meaning of what's happening to us. And so, you know, it's not just about telling stories of nice stories of, you know, women health workers and you know, clapping every night at 7 o'clock and telling those stories of solidarity, but also making sure that we're thinking about the system that needs to change and the potential hopeful future that we can hopefully build through the storytelling, and tapping into ideas of solidarity as opposed to us and them. So many of the narratives that are being put out right now are isolationist, finding someone to blame, the common enemy. And I think that there's a need for a stronger voice of multilateralism, of a global solidarity for the common threats that we face, as opposed to the populism and the nationalism that's happening. And so, you know, there's narrative engagement is an entire practice in and of itself. There's a lot of different organizations that have a lot of resources on this. There's something called the Narrative Initiative that the Ford Foundation and Atlantic Philanthropies and Open Society Foundation all invested in. So maybe my colleague can put up the link to the Narrative Initiative, because I think those are specific tools for those that are working on social justice. Okay, so I don't want to only focus on narrative. We will have another webinar just on this topic, because really being in partnership with those that are thinking deeply about communicating this new story, this new vision, you know, we have a tendency as human beings to be fatalistic. And so I loved that one of the definitions of resiliency actually talked about hope for the future. And I think that engaging in the narrative with intentionality is a part of shaping that hope. So the other topics that I wrote down that you wanted to hear more about was connectivity. And one thing I want to talk about is just how challenging this is. Honestly, I really do acknowledge that in moments of crisis, when we're very worried about our own organizations, it takes extra effort. You know, I talked about how important it is to be dealing with your own well-being, being with your team's well-being. And now on top of all of that, you need to spend time connecting with others. And yet it's a part of the well-being, I think. I think when you take the time to reach out to others to ask how they're experiencing the challenge, both globally and in your own backyard, seeing how you may be able to partner in new ways. Now, again, this takes a lot of creative thinking. It takes time to say, I'm a democracy and governance organization, but I really need to be in relationship with the economic development sector, those organizations and networks that are working on livelihood development, because we're going to be needing to work together in the future. Because right now, once again, going back to the narrative initiative or the narrative concept, there is a false choice being presented to us between economic development. We need our economies to be getting back strong, and the care that we have for each other by needing to continue social distancing, and the ability for citizens to continue to organize. And so the way that our economic development efforts are going to unfold absolutely need to have good governance elements, democratic values embedded in them. And so I think we need to develop new partnerships, and that's what I've been very committed to be connected with those networks of economic development specialists and those who work with chambers of commerce and others, so that we can say, don't forget about democratic values and social justice and the inequalities that we also need to address while we're getting businesses up and running. The other connectivity that I see unfolding, that again takes time because we have different ways of working, we have different ways of seeing the world. The humanitarian relief sector is going to be the most under the gun to deal with the poverty that we're going to be facing, the humanitarian crisis of hunger and the real needs coming out of what's going to be a very prolonged recession. And yet, those humanitarian relief organizations have to have deeply embedded conflict sensitivity within their operations and their implementation. And so peace-building organizations who think deeply about conflict dynamics have to be in partnership with the humanitarian field. And that's been a very we've been trying actually for many years to embed those two ways of thinking, do no harm principles with humanitarian need, as we're delivering relief and humanitarian aid with a conscious concept of the impact on conflict dynamics, because we're also going to see the rise of conflict, and we already have, between the security sector organization, or the security sector that are trying to enforce these restrictions of social distancing and really coming and clashing with citizens in different ways. And then the last thing, I've got 5 minutes left, is just the resiliency ethos. And all I would say is this is a mindfulness practice. Be mindful that we're living in times of uncertainty, so that you can then hold space in your day to both take care of yourself, take care of your people, and then have the time for reading and thinking deeply, so that you can try and have that space for the adaptation that's needed. Okay, so I have to stop because we're about 5 minutes away. I want to end with one just thought for you, and that's we at Partners Global actually do have a North Star. That's a term perhaps in English that I hope translates well. The North Star is this idea of where are we going with all of this? What are we working towards of our big main goal? And we really do want to create a movement of resilient organizations and networks that continue to support each other on this journey, because not only during COVID, but after, we need to shift the way that our collective action, our processes of working and responding as with local organizations and local realities, we need more support for resiliency within our sector, because we also are very committed to changing a paradigm of how civil society is supported and funded. And so if you'd like to include in the chat, as I sign off, please let us know what you'd be the most interested in knowing more about. We're developing a whole series of webinars We'll be having more blogs on each of the factors. And we'd like to be responsive to the things that you'd like to be hearing the most about. And so if you'd like to include in the chat any of additional issues that you'd like to know about, please let us know, and we'll make sure that we get that information to you. And I just want to say a big thank you to all of you for joining us. It's been lovely to have you. Count on us to continue to share information about resiliency. And we really want to continue to have this conversation on a regular basis. We'll be organizing more Zoom calls and webinars on the different aspects of the framework. But again, we'd like to be responsive of those. This definitely has been recorded, and so we'll have this up on our YouTube page as well. You see that we have a hashtag that we use of Resiliency Plus, and we always have a lot of new content and information on all of our social media channels. So thank you again for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you in our future conversations.